No matter what afflictions or what sufferings you're going through, you can be better, not bitter. You can go from the superficial to the supernatural. Hi, I'm Father Cedric, the host of Live with Passion. I'm so glad that you found the program. I want to talk to you about going deeper, going from the superficial to the supernatural. Let me share with you 2 Corinthians. This is Paul speaking. He said, I wanted to tell you about my afflictions that we experienced in Asia. We were so utterly, unbearably crushed that we despaired of life itself. Why, we felt that we had received the sentence of death, but that was to make us rely not on ourselves, but upon God who raises the dead. Wow, what a statement. Paul started to rely upon God who raises the dead in his sufferings. I want you in your sufferings to rely upon God who raises the dead. Let me tell you some stories. I heard about a tree that was on top of a mountain, and it was on top of the mountain, and it was so windy up there. And the tree was constantly buffeted by the wind. And because of all the wind, he looked down and he started to complain because it was so windy. And he looked down, as he looked down, he could see in the valley there was a bunch of other trees, and it wasn't windy down there. And he thought to himself, why do I have to be up here on the mountaintop with all this wind, suffering all the time, when those trees down in the valley, there's nothing wrong with them? Then one day, about a month later, all of a sudden this huge hurricane came. And I mean, the wind was blowing and the mountain was buffeted. And even down in the valley, it got very, very windy, hurricane force winds. And because of all the wind, the trees got knocked over. But the tree on top of the mountain, even though it was very windy up there, it had grown roots, and the roots had gone deep, and the roots were strong, and it was able to handle the buffeting of even those hurricane force winds. And you know what that tells me? That sufferings and hardships and afflictions make our roots go deep so that we can be strong, so that when the afflictions come, when the hardships come, we can be strong in God. That's exactly what Paul prayed. He prayed for the Ephesian community. He said, I want you to be grounded and rooted in Christ. And so think about your afflictions right now, any sufferings that you might be going through. It could be despair or loneliness or hardships or physical sufferings or relationship problems or maybe an addiction. They're meant to make you get rooted in God. This series is called A Different Spirit. I talk about how Caleb had a different spirit than the other 10 that spied out the promised land. And he came back and he said, we are well able to conquer the land. In other words, he had a different spirit, a different attitude. Now, the world, our culture, when it encounters suffering, it says there must not be a God. Why would a good God allow me to suffer? But those of us who are believers, who have a different spirit, when suffering comes, we get rooted in God. So far from saying that God doesn't exist or how can a good God make us suffer, God doesn't make us suffer, but he does allow us, as Paul said, so that we wouldn't rely upon ourselves, but we would rely upon God, be rooted in God, be strong in God who raises the dead. I want you to gain perspective about your afflictions and your sufferings. And as a Catholic priest, I know that you're going through things. I hear your stories. And then I think about my own life. Back when I was a teenager, life was going good, very healthy, very strong, no problems with my body or anything. But then I developed acne, of all things. And I laugh because everybody kind of laughs at acne. You know, you get red blotches on your face. It's kind of funny. but not when you're a teenager and you have acne and you're going to high school. It's devastating. And I mean, I used to judge people by their appearance, by the way they looked, by their surface. But acne slowed me down, made me go deeper, made me think about life, made me open to more. And I actually began to seek God in my affliction. And so that's one of the ways that you can turn your scars into stars, is to find God in your scars. Find God in your afflictions. You can actually discover God through your sufferings. And that's part of the meaning of suffering, that as you go through, you can change, you can grow, you can be rooted in God. So this program is all about going from the superficial, like I used to be, to the supernatural. And it's about turning your scars into stars, your hurts into halos. You don't have to be a victim, you can be a victor because of what you're going through. And that's exactly what Paul was talking about. C.S. Lewis, great novelist, writer, philosopher, he said that suffering is God's megaphone. He said, God whispers to us in our pleasures, but shouts in our suffering. And what does God shout? He's saying, rely upon me, not on yourself. You are mortal, I am immortal. Get rooted in me, not in your looks, in your body, in your abilities, in your control, because when push comes to shove, one day we're going to lose it all. We must be rooted in God. And if we're rooted in God now, like that tree on top of the mountain, when that huge storm comes, when that hurricane comes, I'm talking about death, you will be rooted in God, and all the other trees will be knocked over, but you will be resurrected. So allow your sufferings to teach you. I read a book, and it was called You Gotta Keep Dancing. The front cover of the book has a scar on it. That's interesting. And that spoke volumes to me right away. Well, in that book, Tim Hensel was an expedition leader. He led journeys up mountains and down rivers, and he took people onto a glacier one time. And as he was leading the journey, the glacier, the sun had worn away the glacier a little bit, and it got a little melted, and he slipped and he fell down into a crevice. The crevice was about 15 feet deep, and he ended up breaking his back. It was a freak accident. Well, he was still able to walk, but the problem was the pain, the suffering, chronic, constant, day by day. And it devastated him. It was so hard. Finest doctors tried to help him, but they couldn't take away the pain. So eventually he came to this saying that he knew that he didn't have a choice about the pain, but he had a choice about how he could handle the pain. And he found that he could be joyful even in the midst of pain and suffering. And he came up with all these sayings that I love. You've probably heard some of them. He said, you can either be bitter or better when you suffer. You can be a victim or a victor. You can have a breakdown or a breakthrough. Life can be a tombstone or a stepping stone, a prison or a prism. You can turn your hurts into halos, and you can turn your scars into stars. So whatever scars you have, you can turn them into stars. You can have a better attitude. You can be rooted in God. It's all your choice. And even in the midst of pain, whatever pain or suffering that you have, you can actually come to a great joy because God is with you. So what afflictions do you have? What are you going through? I remember my sister, I have two older sisters, and one of my sisters contacted this rare disease. It's called Guillain-Barré syndrome. It's an autoimmune disease that makes you tired. It kind of takes the life out of you. She used to have a lot of energy. She was a triathlete and loved to bike, loved to hike, loved to swim, loved to run. Then 2 weeks later, she's in a wheelchair. took all the energy. She had to have blood transfusions. It's been very tough. Well, for some reason, as we grew up, my sister and I kind of had that sibling rivalry, didn't get along all that well, kind of had some conflicts. Well, that suffering has softened her. She's become very open toward me now, very communicative, and we get along very well. And I'm believing that that suffering is going to open her up to God so that she can have a personal relationship with God. And that really is the purpose of sufferings, to open us, to take us from the surface level, from the superficial to the supernatural, so that we can become better people and that we can find God. Remember Paul the Apostle, I just opened with that reading, he talked about being crushed and being afflicted. His credentials as an apostle wasn't his religious standing, it was the sufferings that he went through. When he talked about his credentials as an apostle, he talked about his shipwrecks and his stonings and his beatings for Christ. He said, these are my credentials, his sufferings. And he didn't like sufferings any more than you or I do, but what happened one time he was praying and he had some kind of an affliction, a thorn in the flesh, maybe it was acne, who knows. He asked God to take it away. In fact, more than asked, he begged God. Paul the Apostle, begging God 3 times, if anybody would have their prayer answered, it would be Paul. He begged God 3 times for God to take that affliction away from him, that thorn in the flesh. And you know what God's answer was? He said, Paul, my grace is sufficient for you. I'm sure you've begged God, take it away. Take away the depression. Take away the loneliness. Take away the physical sufferings. And God is saying, my grace is sufficient for you. This too shall pass. You can be strong. You can be better, not bitter. So I'm thinking about some friends that I have. They're going through some sufferings right now. One of my friends has prostate cancer. Another of my friends was having kidney and liver problems so bad that it infected his body, ended up in a coma for a month. He's now out of the coma. Another friend of mine has brain cancer, just had surgery. All 3 of them, they're not like the rest of the world saying, why did God do this to me? Or there must not be a God to allow this type of suffering. Rather, all 3 of them have a different spirit. And they're trusting in God, relying upon God, getting rooted in God in the midst of their suffering. And it's the same for you. Maybe you don't have brain cancer, I hope you don't, or you're not in a coma, or perhaps you don't have cancer, I hope you don't. But get rooted in God no matter what you're going through. Turn your scars into stars by being rooted in God, by having a better attitude, by being better, not bitter, and you can find joy in the midst of it all. And I'm telling you that sufferings do have purpose. The world says, no, it doesn't. How can God do this to me? But believers have a different spirit. We find meaning in the pain. We find purpose in the suffering. And God shouts to us in our sufferings. I have done some ministry in the 12-step program. If you know anything about the 12 steps, that's addiction programs like Alcoholics Anonymous, Overeaters Anonymous, Gamblers Anonymous, all those anonymous programs. In fact, I filmed a 4-part series about the 12-step program. Go to my website and you can see how you can order it. And what I discovered is this, that many people who get addicted, they come into, and this is a tremendous suffering, many people who get addicted don't have God in their life, and they actually, get this now, they find God, they discover God through their addiction. And I want you to get that because there's purpose in your suffering. You can find God in your addiction. You can find God in your affliction. You can find God no matter what you're going through, no matter what the affliction or the suffering or the pain is. You can discover and then get rooted in God, and that really is the purpose of life.